On October 19, 2000, a brilliant young archivist named Arthur Hayes vanished from the heart of American history, the Library of Congress. For 18 long years, his case was more than just a mystery. It was a stain on a family's name, a story of betrayal where the guardian of history was branded a common thief. His disappearance was officially labeled a high-stakes heist, a narrative that conveniently explained away both a missing man and a collection of priceless historical documents. But the official story was a lie. It wasn't until a single, anonymously returned book surfaced, a forgotten volume from 1950, that a hidden photograph threatened to unravel a conspiracy buried deep within the nation's most sacred institution. How could the truth remain hidden for so long, in plain sight, sheltered by the very walls meant to preserve it? Before we reveal how a simple returned book exposed a secret society, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the chain of events this one photograph set in motion. The official timeline of Arthur Hayes' last known hours was deceptively simple, constructed to support a predetermined conclusion. That Thursday night, he had called his younger sister, Eleanor, his voice buzzing with an excitement she hadn't heard in years. He spoke of a find that could rewrite the history of the Revolutionary-era collection, promising to tell her everything the next day. A lone security guard later reported seeing him leave through a rear exit around midnight, carrying only a leather satchel. When Arthur failed to appear for work on Friday, his absence was noted. But when the library administration simultaneously reported the disappearance of several invaluable, unpublished drafts from the Founding Fathers, the narrative was set. The Washington, D.C. police didn't launch a missing person investigation. They launched a manhunt for a thief. Arthur Hayes, the quiet academic, was now an international fugitive. The conflict was established not as a search for a lost man, but as a pursuit of a criminal mastermind. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the man. Arthur Hayes was not a thief. At 34, he was an introvert whose world was bound by the scent of aging paper and the weight of history in his hands. He was a prodigy in his field, a man who could supposedly identify the origin of a colonial-era document by its smell alone. His life was a quiet devotion to the past, with a singular ambition, to one day lead the National Archives. He was the immense pride of his modest, aging parents, and the anchor for his sister, Eleanor, a law student who saw in his passion a purity the rest of the world lacked. But Arthur had a fatal vulnerability, not a physical one, but an emotional one. He possessed an unwavering, almost naive faith in the sanctity of academic institutions and the integrity of his mentors. He truly believed knowledge was above human greed, a belief that made him the perfect guardian of history, but also the most tragic kind of victim. For the Hayes family, the official investigation was a second, more brutal kind of disappearance. The initial shock of Arthur being missing was quickly eclipsed by the horror of his public vilification. The police, heavily influenced by the library's administration, treated the family not with sympathy, but with suspicion. Every question was laced with the assumption that they were hiding something, that they knew where their criminal son had fled. News reports painted Arthur as a disgruntled employee who had meticulously planned his escape, selling off pieces of American history to the highest bidder on the European black market. His parents, once so proud, retreated into a shell of shame and silence. Eleanor watched as the brother she admired was erased, replaced by a caricature of a greedy intellectual. The pain of his absence was a constant ache, but the public destruction of his character was a wound that refused to stop bleeding, poisoning their lives for years to come. The setting itself was a character in the story, a silent accomplice to the crime. Washington, D.C. in the year 2000 was a city on the brink of a new millennium, yet its oldest institutions, like the Library of Congress, were still deeply rooted in an analog world. It was a time before the omnipresent security state that would follow 9/11. Video surveillance was sparse and often low quality. Records were meticulously kept on paper ledgers, and communication relied on landlines and fledgling email systems that left few digital footprints. The library was a sanctuary of knowledge, but it was also a labyrinth of corridors, forgotten sub-basements, and millions of volumes, a perfect place to bury a secret. This environment, a bustling political capital surrounding a temple of history, provided the ideal stage for a man to be erased and for a conspiracy to fester, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the nation's collected memory. The years that followed were a cruel montage of silence and false hope. The investigation quickly went cold, relegated to a file cabinet filled with dead-end theories. International alerts yielded nothing. A supposed sighting of a man matching Arthur's description in an Argentinian cafe led Eleanor on a frantic, soul-crushing journey that ended in disappointment. An anonymous email years later claiming Arthur was living under a new name in Prague reignited a flicker of hope that was just as quickly extinguished by authorities who dismissed it as a hoax. Each false lead was a fresh torment. Her parents passed away, their final years clouded by the unresolved grief and the public shame of their son's alleged crimes. Now alone, Eleanor, a determined lawyer, transformed her brother's old bedroom into an obsessive incident room. The walls became a collage of maps, photos, and news clippings, a private, desperate crusade to clear his name that consumed her life for nearly 2 decades, isolating her from a world that had already moved on. The initial police investigation, if one could even call it that, was less a search for a man and more a bureaucratic exercise in closing a file. Guided almost entirely by the library's administration, the narrative was swiftly cemented. Arthur Hayes was a fugitive. His photograph, once a smiling image on his parents' mantelpiece, was now distributed to international law enforcement agencies under the stark, damning headline, "Wanted." The search for a missing person was officially suspended, replaced by a global alert for a high-value thief. For the Hayes family, this was not just an injustice. It was a second, more calculated disappearance. The authorities didn't just fail to find Arthur. They actively participated in erasing the man he was, replacing him with a convenient fiction that served an institution's reputation over an individual's life. The case was effectively closed before it ever truly opened, a cold, clinical decision that left a family to fend for itself in a storm of public condemnation. Eleanor, then in her final year of law school, tried to fight the tide of institutional certainty with the fragile shield of her own conviction. She presented letters, academic awards, and heartfelt testimonials from colleagues who knew her brother's character. She pointed out the glaring inconsistencies that the police willfully ignored. Why would a man planning a multi-million-dollar heist leave behind his passport, his wallet, and every cent in his bank account? Why would he call his sister bubbling with academic excitement just hours before committing a crime that would obliterate his career? But her desperate logic was met with condescending pats on the shoulder and the weary sighs of detectives who had already made up their minds. To them, she wasn't a credible witness. She was just another grieving relative lost in denial, an emotional obstacle in a straightforward case of greed and betrayal. Her voice was drowned out by the official story, a story too simple and too clean to be true. For Arthur's parents, the public shaming was a slow, creeping poison that seeped into the foundations of their quiet suburban life. The pride they once felt was replaced by a profound, suffocating shame. Neighbors who had once praised their son's brilliance now averted their gaze in the grocery store. The phone, once a source of connection, fell silent. Their home became a sanctuary and a prison, a place where they could grieve in private, but also a place where the silence echoed with unanswered questions. His mother continued to wash and fold his clothes, an act of faith that became a ritual of torment. His father would spend hours in the garage, staring at the old car they had been fixing up together, a project, like their son's life, left unfinished. They were living a public nightmare, judged by a world that believed their son was a criminal, a pain far sharper than the simple, clean grief of a known death. The psychological term for what the Hayes family endured is ambiguous loss, a state of limbo where a loved one is physically absent but psychologically present. There is no body to mourn, no funeral to mark an ending, and therefore no path to closure. For Eleanor, This meant living in a perpetual state of alert, a prisoner of hope. Every time the phone rang, her heart would leap with a sickening mix of dread and anticipation. Every tall, slender man she saw from a distance in a crowded street could be him, a fleeting mirage that left her breathless and trembling. She couldn't fully grieve, because a part of her refused to believe he was gone forever. This constant, unresolved tension shaped her entire adult life, preventing her from forming lasting relationships or pursuing a career beyond the singular, all-consuming mission of finding answers. She was frozen in that October of 2000, forever waiting for her brother to come home and explain everything. A faint glimmer of a different truth emerged 3 years after Arthur vanished. A former junior librarian, his conscience weighing on him, sent Eleanor an anonymous, typewritten letter. He wrote that he had overheard a vicious argument between Arthur and his esteemed mentor, the director of special collections, just days before the disappearance. The words he caught were forgeries and betrayal of trust. The young man was terrified, but he felt the family deserved to know that Arthur was upset about something inside the library, not planning a life of crime. Eleanor took the letter straight to the cold case squad. The detective barely glanced at it before handing it back. The mentor was a titan in the academic world, a man with unimpeachable integrity. The anonymous tip, they concluded, was likely a cruel prank or a disgruntled employee's fantasy. That door was slammed shut, but for Eleanor, a seed of suspicion was planted. The conspiracy wasn't just hiding Arthur. It was being protected by those in power. As the years bled into one another, the world outside the Hayes family's bubble of grief simply forgot. Arthur Hayes became a footnote, a trivia question for true crime enthusiasts, the brilliant archivist who got away with it. The case file was boxed up and moved to a dusty storage facility, a relic of a pre-9/11 world. New detectives took over, with new priorities and no emotional connection to the case. The media moved on to newer, more sensational stories. But for Eleanor, the passage of time did not heal. It sharpened her resolve. Her brother's old bedroom, once a shrine of sorrow, slowly transformed. The posters on the wall were replaced by maps of Europe and South America, timelines of events, and a complex web of photographs connected by red string. While the world forgot, she remembered. While the investigation grew cold, her obsession burned hotter, a solitary flame of defiance against the crushing silence of the years. The final devastating blow came 12 years after Arthur's disappearance. First, her father succumbed to a heart attack, his doctor quietly admitting that years of unresolved stress had likely taken their toll. 18 months later, her mother passed away in her sleep, having withered into a ghost of her former self, a woman who simply lost the will to live without answers. They died without ever learning the truth, their final years defined by the shame and sorrow of a crime their son never committed. Standing alone in the empty family home, Eleanor felt the full weight of her solitude. She was now the sole guardian of Arthur's memory, the only person left on earth who still believed in his innocence. The deaths of her parents was not an ending but a consecration. Her fight was no longer just for her brother. It was a promise made to the ghosts of her family, a vow to reclaim their name, no matter how long it took or what it would cost her. Then, in the fall of 2018, 18 years into the suffocating silence, the past returned itself through the U.S. Postal Service. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, in a plain brown paper-wrapped package with no return address, dropped into a standard return slot at the Library of Congress. Inside was a single, unassuming book, a 1950 edition of Chronicles of the Early Republic. To the young librarian on duty, it was just one of thousands of items processed that week. The book was logged, scanned, and placed on a cart for reshelving. For a few hours it sat there, a dormant time bomb, its explosive secret hidden within its aging pages. Had it been a different librarian, a different day, it might have been placed back on a shelf, its secret entombed for another 70 years. But fate, it seems, had finally decided to intervene in the story of Arthur Hayes. The librarian, a recent graduate named Maya, was known for her meticulous attention to detail. As she lifted the book, she noticed it felt off balance, heavier in the middle than it should have been. A faint, musty smell, different from the usual scent of old paper, caught her attention. Running her thumb along the edge of the pages, she felt a slight bulge. Instead of ignoring it, she carefully opened the book to the middle. There, nestled in a hollowed-out section, was a single Polaroid photograph, its colors slightly faded by time. It was a relic from a different era, preserved like a pressed flower. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She knew, with a sudden and chilling certainty, that this was not a forgotten bookmark. This was something that had been intentionally hidden, a message sent across a gulf of nearly 2 decades, waiting for the right person to find it. The image was grainy, taken in the low, harsh light of what looked like a sub-basement or an archive storage room. It depicted 4 men. One of them was instantly recognizable from the old wanted posters that still occasionally surfaced in online forums: Arthur Hayes. But this was not the face of a calm, calculating thief. His expression was one of desperate, cornered anguish. He was gesturing wildly, his mouth open in a silent argument, his body tense. Facing him were 3 older men, their faces obscured by shadows, but their postures were menacing, almost predatory. They had him surrounded. The photograph captured a moment of intense confrontation, a silent, explosive drama that completely contradicted the official narrative of a man who had simply walked away. Arthur hadn't left. He had been confronted by something, or someone, that terrified him. Maya's hands trembled as she turned the small photograph over. On the back, written in a shaky, spidery script that spoke of age or fear, was a single cryptic word: circle. Nothing else. No date, no names, no explanation. Just that one word, pregnant with meaning she couldn't yet grasp. Having grown up in the D.C. area, Maya had heard the whispers of the Hayes case, the brilliant archivist who vanished with a fortune in historical documents. It was a local legend, a cautionary tale. But this photograph, this single word, felt like a ghost crying out from the past. It didn't feel like evidence of a theft. It felt like evidence of a crime. She knew instinctively that turning this over to the library's administration or the police, the very institutions that had condemned Arthur Hayes, might be a mistake. This secret had been kept for 18 years for a reason. Instead, Maya went home and spent the night researching. She found articles about Eleanor Hayes, the sister who never gave up, the lawyer who had sacrificed her life to a cold case. The next morning, with a deep breath, she made a call to Eleanor's law office. She explained what she had found, her voice low and nervous, as if she were revealing a state secret. For Eleanor, who had lived through countless cruel hoaxes and crushing dead ends, the call was a jolt to a system long numb with disappointment. She listened with cautious, hardened skepticism, but something in the young librarian's voice, a genuine fear and gravity, made her agree to a meeting. She drove to a quiet coffee shop, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of hope. She prepared herself for another heartbreak, another ghost from a well-meaning stranger. When Maya slid the Polaroid across the table, the air left Eleanor's lungs. It was him. It was Arthur's face, not in a cherished family photo, but contorted in fear and anger. Seeing him like this, trapped in this forgotten moment, was like a physical blow. All the years of forced composure, of stoic determination, crumbled. For the first time, she had proof that she wasn't just a sister lost in denial. He hadn't run away. He had been fighting for something. Then she turned the photo over and saw the word, circle. The word snagged on a distant memory, a vague recollection of Arthur mentioning something about an informal academic group, a circle of influential historians and collectors he admired. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now, written on the back of this terrifying image, it sounded like an epitaph. This single photograph changed everything. It was a grenade thrown into the cold, settled narrative of the past 2 decades. The official story, so carefully constructed by the library and the police, was that Arthur Hayes acted alone. But the photo proved he was with at least 3 other men on the night he vanished. It shifted the entire paradigm of the case. The question was no longer, where did Arthur Hayes go? But, who were these men, and what did they do to him? Armed with the first real piece of evidence since 2000, Eleanor was no longer just the grieving sister. She was a lawyer with a lead, a case, and a target. The 18 years of silence were over. The hunt for a thief had ended, and the investigation into a conspiracy had just begun. Eleanor, now armed with the first tangible lead in 18 years, channeled her grief into a cold, methodical focus. The word circle became her singular obsession. She retrieved Arthur's personal effects from storage, boxes she hadn't had the strength to open for nearly 2 decades. The scent of his old books and clothes was a painful echo of the past, but she pushed through it, transforming from a grieving sister into a forensic investigator. For weeks, she lived among his ghosts, poring over every word in his academic journals, his daily planners, and his personal letters. She was searching for a needle in a haystack, a single mention of a circle, hidden within the mundane details of a life cut short. The initial search yielded nothing, a maddening exercise that tested the limits of her renewed hope. But the image of her brother's terrified face was a constant, driving force. This was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about finding his killers. The breakthrough came from the one place she had overlooked, Arthur's old mahogany desk, a relic that had sat dormant in a climate-controlled storage unit. She had it moved to her office, where it stood like a silent monument to his last days. As she meticulously emptied its drawers, her fingers caught on a loose piece of trim on the underside. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was a false bottom, a secret compartment. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Inside, nestled in the shallow space, was a small black moleskin notebook she had never seen before. It was not his regular journal. She opened it, and the first page, written in Arthur's neat, precise script, delivered a chilling revelation. The title read, CC Observations. CC, the Columbian Circle. The name was unfamiliar, yet it felt like the key to everything. This was the secret he died protecting. The notebook was a horrifying chronicle of her brother's private investigation. Over several months, Arthur had meticulously documented his growing suspicions about a clandestine group operating from within the very heart of the library. He had noticed subtle, almost imperceptible discrepancies in the archives, historical documents that felt wrong to the touch, inks that seemed too vibrant, and watermarks that were slightly off. He detailed a disturbing pattern where priceless artifacts were temporarily moved for off-site restoration, only to be returned and replaced by what he was convinced were flawless forgeries. The notebook contained lists of names, dates, and accession numbers, but the name that appeared most frequently, often circled and followed by a question mark, was that of his own mentor, the celebrated director of special collections, Dr. Alistair Finch, the same man who had publicly mourned the loss of his troubled but brilliant protégé. A wave of nausea washed over Eleanor. Alistair Finch had been a fixture in their family's life, a kind, avuncular figure who had championed Arthur's career. He had been the one to console her parents, expressing his profound disappointment over Arthur's alleged betrayal. Now, reading her brother's secret notes, she saw the monstrous deception. Arthur had documented how Finch used his authority to control access to the most secure vaults, personally approving the very transfers that aroused suspicion, and deflecting any and all inquiries with his unimpeachable reputation. The notebook was a damning roadmap to the conspiracy. It outlined a sophisticated operation involving a network of academics, wealthy private collectors, and key library staff who were systematically plundering America's history for immense profit, swapping priceless originals with perfect replicas, and selling the real artifacts on a clandestine market. The next task was to put faces to the shadows in the photograph. Using the names in Arthur's notebook as her guide, Eleanor began a digital manhunt. She spent countless hours sifting through archived photos of library galas, academic conferences, and staff directories from the late 1990s. One by one, the blurry figures from the Polaroid sharpened into focus. One was a prominent philanthropist and a major donor to the library, a man renowned for his vast private collection of Americana. The other was a senior security official who had taken an early retirement just months after Arthur vanished. The pieces of the puzzle locked into place with terrifying clarity. Finch provided the access, the philanthropist provided the money and the buyers, and the security chief ensured that any investigation would look in the wrong direction. Arthur hadn't just stumbled upon a simple theft. He had uncovered a deeply entrenched criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight. With this new understanding, the official narrative of the crime shattered completely. The motive was now horribly clear. The stolen documents Arthur was accused of taking weren't for his own profit. They were the very evidence he had gathered to expose the circle. His excited phone call to Eleanor that night wasn't about a historical discovery. It was about having the final piece of proof he needed. He had likely confronted Finch and the others, naively believing he could appeal to their sense of duty and convince them to return the stolen artifacts. It was a fatal miscalculation, born from his unwavering faith in the institution and the man he considered his mentor. He couldn't fathom that they would resort to murder to protect their secrets. The story of the heist was their masterstroke, a cruel and brilliant piece of misdirection that used Arthur's own evidence to brand him a thief and bury their crime forever. Eleanor knew she couldn't take this to the DC police. Not yet. The department had been complicit, whether through gross incompetence or something more sinister, in cementing the false narrative 18 years ago. The security chief's involvement suggested the cover-up might have had allies within local law enforcement. She needed an outside agency, one with federal jurisdiction and no connection to the original, corrupted investigation. She meticulously compiled a comprehensive file, high-resolution scans of the notebook's pages, the photograph, her own research linking the names and faces, and a detailed timeline of events. With the weight of 2 decades of pain and resolve behind her, she picked up the phone and dialed the main line for the FBI's Washington field office. Her voice was steady, clear, and devoid of emotion. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she began. "I have new evidence regarding the 2000 disappearance of my brother, Arthur Hayes. This is now a homicide investigation." The FBI's approach to Dr. Alistair Finch was surgical. They didn't storm his stately Georgetown home with sirens blaring. Instead, 2 senior agents from the art crime team arrived on a quiet weekday morning, their demeanor respectful but unyielding. Finch, now in his late 70s and slowed by age, greeted them with an air of academic curiosity, as if they were colleagues coming to consult on a historical manuscript. He ushered them into a study, a room lined with leather-bound books and smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. A perfect replica of the institutional power he had wielded for decades. He offered them tea, a disarming gesture from a man who had spent a lifetime controlling narratives. But the agents weren't there for pleasantries. They were there to dismantle a lie 18 years in the making, and they knew the man before them was its chief architect. The interrogation began gently. The agent spoke of Arthur Hayes with a tone of reverence, acknowledging his talent and his tragic story. Finch played his part perfectly, the grieving mentor, recounting with practiced sorrow how his promising protege had succumbed to greed. He was smooth, believable, his reputation a formidable shield. Then, the first agent placed the Polaroid on the polished mahogany desk. Finch's composure flickered for a fraction of a second, a tightening of the jaw, a slight paling of his skin. He dismissed it as a fabrication, a cruel prank. But then the second agent opened a file and began to read from Arthur's notebook. They read Arthur's own words describing his admiration for Finch, followed by his dawning horror as he uncovered the forgeries. The words hung in the air, a ghost's testimony from a book-lined tomb. Finch's shield of academic dignity began to crack under the weight of his student's voice. The breaking point came when the agent read the final entry Arthur ever wrote. It wasn't an accusation, but a plea. "I must talk to Alistair," Arthur had written. "He will understand. He believes in the sanctity of this place as much as I do. He will make it right. Hearing those words, a testament to the blind faith he had so ruthlessly betrayed, something inside the old man finally shattered. The facade of the esteemed academic crumbled, revealing the frail, terrified man beneath. His shoulders slumped, and a dry, ragged sob escaped his lips. The fight was over. For the next 4 hours, with a tape recorder running, Alistair Finch confessed everything. The carefully constructed world of lies he had inhabited for nearly 2 decades dissolved into a stream of whispered, horrifying truths, a poison that had finally found its way out. His confession laid bare the rot at the heart of the Columbian Circle. It hadn't started with greed, he explained, but with an intoxicating intellectual arrogance. They saw themselves not as thieves, but as the true guardians of history, men of taste and intellect, who believed priceless artifacts were wasted on the general public. They began by liberating items they felt they could better appreciate, justifying their actions as a form of preservation. The philanthropist, a man with bottomless wealth and a voracious appetite for the unique, funded the operation, paying for the flawless forgeries that would replace the originals. It was a gentleman's club of cultural vandalism, cloaked in the language of scholarship. But what began as a high-minded conspiracy had inevitably devolved into a simple, brutal criminal enterprise, one that would do anything to protect itself from the light. On that October night, Arthur Hayes, armed with his damning evidence, confronted Finch and 2 other Circle members in a secure sub-basement. According to Finch, Arthur never threatened to go to the police. He was too much of an idealist for that. Instead, he appealed to their honor, to their duty as historians. He laid out his proof and simply asked them to return the stolen artifacts, to quietly undo the damage they had done. He believed he was speaking to fellow academics. But the philanthropist, the group's cold-blooded financier, saw only a loose end that could unravel their entire empire. While Finch hesitated, paralyzed by his protégé, Gu's earnest plea, the philanthropist gave a silent nod to the third man. Arthur's naive faith in his mentor was his death sentence. He never saw the blow coming from behind. The cover-up was as cold and calculated as the murder itself. They knew that a simple disappearance would invite endless questions. So they crafted a new narrative, a masterpiece of misdirection. They used the very documents Arthur had gathered as evidence against them to frame him as a thief. The security chief, a member of their circle, falsified the logbooks and provided a witness statement of Arthur leaving with a satchel, creating the illusion of a planned escape. The final, most ghoulish act was to hide his body where no one would ever think to look. Finch, his voice barely a whisper, confessed that Arthur Hayes, the man who had dedicated his life to the Library of Congress, had never left it. He was entombed within its very walls, a permanent, silent resident of the institution he had loved. Following Finch's trembling directions, a team of FBI agents and forensic specialists descended into the library's forgotten depths, to a section of the sub-basement that had been sealed off for a supposed asbestos abatement project in the winter of 2000. Behind a cinderblock wall that was not on any of the building's official blueprints, they found him. Arthur Hayes' remains were there, wrapped in archival plastic, a final, bitter irony. The 18-year search was over. Eleanor stood outside, watching as they brought her brother out into the daylight for the first time in nearly 2 decades. There was no relief in that moment, only the profound, crushing weight of a truth finally unearthed. Her fight was over, but the silence her brother left behind would now be filled with the full, horrific story of his last, desperate stand for history. The news of the arrest sent a seismic shockwave through the quiet, hallowed halls of academia and Washington, D.C.'s elite circles. The story of Arthur Hayes, the thieving archivist, was not just corrected, it was violently inverted. He was no longer a villain, but a martyr. The Columbian Circle, once a name known only to its secretive members, was now splashed across every major news outlet, a symbol of profound institutional rot. The scandal was a devastating blow to the Library of Congress, forcing a painful and public reckoning with its own failures. For nearly 2 decades, an institution dedicated to preserving the truth had been the primary instrument in perpetuating a monstrous lie. The public was left to grapple with a chilling question: if a man could be murdered and buried within the nation's most sacred repository of knowledge, what other secrets were hidden on its shelves? The trial was not a spectacle of legal theatrics, but a somber, methodical dismantling of a conspiracy. The prosecution, led by a team from the U.S. Attorney's Office, presented an overwhelming case built upon 3 unshakable pillars: the chilling words from Arthur's own notebook, the grainy Polaroid photograph that started it all, and the quiet, devastating confession of Dr. Alistair Finch. The surviving members of the Circle, the wealthy philanthropist, and the former security chief, offered weak defenses that crumbled under the weight of the evidence. In the end, justice, though delayed, was absolute. The philanthropist was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Finch, for his cooperation, received the same sentence, destined to live out his final years in a cell, haunted by the memory of the brilliant student he had betrayed. The security chief received a 20-year sentence for his role in the cover-up, a man who sold his integrity to protect murderers. For Eleanor, the verdicts provided a sense of finality, but not peace. The true moment of closure came weeks later, at a memorial service held in the main reading room of the Library of Congress, the very heart of the institution that had wronged her family so deeply. The new director issued a formal, unreserved public apology, officially clearing Arthur's name and announcing the creation of a permanent fellowship in his honor. Standing before a crowd of librarians, historians, and federal agents, Eleanor spoke not of anger or vengeance, but of her brother's unwavering passion for the truth. She painted a portrait of the man, not the myth, reclaiming his identity from the caricature of the thief. That day, surrounded by the books he loved, Arthur Hayes was finally brought home, his legacy no longer defined by a lie, but by his ultimate sacrifice for the history he swore to protect. The investigation into the Columbian Circle triggered a global treasure hunt. Armed with Finch's detailed records, the FBI's art crime team embarked on an unprecedented international recovery mission. The trail led them to private vaults in Switzerland, auction houses in London, and the lavish estates of collectors who had, unknowingly, and sometimes knowingly, purchased pieces of America's stolen heritage. Over the next few years, dozens of artifacts were repatriated. A priceless letter from Abraham Lincoln discussing the Emancipation Proclamation was recovered from a mansion in Dubai. An original draft of the Bill of Rights was found hidden in a Japanese corporate collection. Each returned item was a victory, a piece of Arthur's legacy made tangible. The collection he died to protect was slowly being reassembled, a testament to the fact that, while history can be stolen, the truth, eventually, finds its way back to the light. In the quiet aftermath, Eleanor Hayes found herself at a crossroads. The singular mission that had consumed her entire adult life was over. The walls of her incident room, once covered in maps and theories, were now bare. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with a new sense of purpose. In 2021, she used a portion of the civil settlement from the Library of Congress to establish the Hayes Foundation for Heritage Repatriation. It was a new kind of war room, this time staffed with art historians, forensic scientists, and legal experts. Her personal crusade became a global mission, using cutting-edge technology to identify forgeries and legally pursue the return of stolen cultural artifacts for countries all over the world. She had spent 18 years fighting for one man's history. Now, she would spend the rest of her life fighting for everyone's. The case of Arthur Hayes left an indelible scar on the institutions sworn to protect our collective memory. The Library of Congress implemented sweeping reforms, including the Hayes Protocols, a rigorous new system of digital tracking and forensic verification for its most valuable assets. Arthur's story became a mandatory part of the curriculum for archivists and historians across the country, a cautionary tale of intellectual arrogance and the deadly cost of silence. Though his name was cleared and his killers brought to justice, the 18 years of pain inflicted upon his family can never be undone. The truth was finally unearthed, but it was found in a grave. A life was honored, but only after it was destroyed. It serves as a permanent, haunting reminder that the most important stories are often the most fiercely guarded, and that the guardians of history sometimes pay the ultimate price to ensure they are told. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten, and that the search for truth is fundamental, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening. The story of Arthur Hayes is, in the end, a chronicle of two legacies. The first is the one he left behind, a collection of priceless historical artifacts returned to their rightful place, and a seismic shift in how cultural institutions protect their treasures. His name, once a byword for betrayal, is now etched into the very protocols designed to prevent such a crime from ever happening again. The Hayes Fellowship at the Library of Congress ensures that a new generation of archivists will learn his story, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to integrity. He became the guardian of history in a way he never could have imagined, his sacrifice forcing an entire field to confront its own vulnerabilities. He is the ghost in the archive, a permanent reminder that the pursuit of truth sometimes requires the ultimate price. But there is a second, more personal legacy, the one forged by his sister. Eleanor Hayes transformed 18 years of private anguish into a public force for good. The Hayes Foundation became her life's work, a global continuation of the promise she made in her brother's quiet, memorabilia-filled bedroom. It is an organization built from the ashes of her family's pain, dedicated to ensuring that no other story of stolen heritage is silenced by power or forgotten by time. She took the darkest chapter of her life and turned it into a beacon for others, fighting for the lost histories of nations with the same relentless determination she once used to fight for her brother. Her victory was not in the courtroom verdicts, but in the purpose she found beyond her own grief, honoring Arthur not just by clearing his name, but by continuing his work on a global scale. The case also leaves us with a powerful and unsettling lesson about the nature of truth itself. For nearly 2 decades, a lie was protected by the very institution designed to preserve facts. The truth was not uncovered by a sprawling police investigation or a technological marvel, but by a simple analog act, the return of a forgotten book. It suggests that history has a strange, persistent gravity. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, yearn to be told. The photograph, the notebook, the final confession, they were all echoes from the past waiting for someone to listen. It is a chilling reminder that the most profound conspiracies are often hidden, not in the shadows, but in plain sight, shielded by reputation, authority, and the world's willingness to accept the simplest, most convenient story. Ultimately, the resolution is not a happy one. It is a just one, but it is steeped in irreversible loss. Justice cannot rewind the clock. It cannot give Arthur Hayes back his life, nor can it erase the 18 years of shame and sorrow that destroyed his parents. The verdicts brought accountability, but not restoration. The empty chairs at the family dinner table remain empty. This is the brutal reality of a cold case solved too late. The truth, when it finally arrives, can feel less like a comforting light and more like a harsh, unforgiving spotlight, illuminating the full, devastating extent of what was lost. The Hayes family got their answers, but they were answers to questions that should never have had to be asked in the first place. The story of Arthur Hayes is more than a cold case. It is a testament to the enduring power of a single person's fight against a wall of silence. It is a reminder that behind every forgotten file and dusty evidence box, there is a human story waiting to be told, a life waiting to be honored. It proves that no secret is permanent, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, can find its way home. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten, and that the search for truth is fundamental, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening.